Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of April 12th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin, joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Good afternoon, Josh.
Good afternoon, sir.
So after some discussion of the many things going on in the world right now and lots of activity at the legislature, we kind of decided to go a little bit macro or a little bit higher level today in some ways, although it certainly engages what's going on in the legislature, and talk a little bit about some of the high profile corporate pushback to voting legislation that is making its way through the Texas legislature. After some selected but kind of high-profile pushback to voting legislation passed earlier this year in Georgia, including most recently and probably most severely, I think, Major League Baseball pulling the All-Star game and moving it to Denver, of all places, Texas is now shifted into the media spotlight as the raft of voting legislation that we've talked about in recent weeks continues to move through the process. So the Texas Senate has passed SB 7 and sent it to the House, and SB 7 is the omnibus bill in the House, although there's all kinds of other voting bills, several of which were heard in committee this week. The House omnibus bill, HB 6, has moved out of committee, but hasn't yet been put on the calendar. So we've got big bills moving and lots of other things still churning through both elections committees. In Texas, three corporations, American Airlines, Dell, a homegrown Texas company, we should say, and Prudential, have issued statements critical of this legislation that really echoes the kind of the corporate response to legislation in Georgia. And I think it's that kind of movement and sort of the fact that Georgia has kind of gone now farther in the process that's really, I think, given Texas a lot of attention. There's a big article in the Washington Post over the weekend about this. Times had covered it recently. Then over the weekend, there was a Zoom, a Zoom meeting among 100 corporate executives that was organized by a Yale management professor who apparently puts these confabs together. But this meeting was, focused on discussing potential ways that corporate leaders could oppose such voting legislation. I think tellingly, there was no consensus, no action taken. But the meeting got a ton of coverage. I mean, it was covered by several of the major networks, was all over cable, it was all over the major newspapers. Now, the corporate action has gotten, not a small amount of pushback from Republican political leaders, from Mitch McConnell at the national level to, in Texas, the lieutenant governor, who was particularly vitriolic about this last week. And of course, the usual, nasty, self-satisfied tweets. That,
right. Well, that's life.
Are going to accompany this on either side, and that's a bipartisan activity, as we know particularly well. So I think the corporate pushback can tell us, I think, some things about the state and nature of the GOP, or at least raise some questions. It seems to me to be, to point to a lot of different things.
Yeah, before getting there, I think it is. This is something that's really motivated a lot of interest. And some of it is sort of breathless and not really very well thought out, as sort of some corporate leaders discuss, let's say withholding contributions or making these statements. I think, there's some simplistic responses that kind of say, well, GOP's done.
I think that's right.
And I think some of that is clearly wishful thinking, on the parts of some people saying it. But it does, but I think, if you take just a little bit of time and start to think about this, it's sort of obvious that there are a lot of cross currents here. It's not even necessarily obvious to me that the cross currents that we're talking about are even the same cross currents for everybody, right? So, what the politicians are reacting to this and what the corporate leaders are reacting to in this, it's not necessarily even the same thing.
And what the public sees.
Sees and how the media is covering it. So it is a really kind of an interesting meta piece, is taking as a departure point this idea that the Republican Party has traditionally been considered the party of, quote unquote corporate interests, which is a pretty broad brush.
Yeah, which is definitely oversimplifies the degree, to which there is partisan structure among corporate interests and firms, and the dynamic. A lot of this was focused on campaign contributions in the early phase. The most recent discussion in a lot of ways, of kind of corporate citizenship and corporate, quote unquote corporate political activism really kind of came up, most recently when, several, major corporations suggested that or announced that they would suspend political contributions in the wake of the January 6th events at the Capitol. And, that's kind of petered out, frankly, near as I can tell in a lot of ways. But there's continuity between that discussion and this one. And I think, as we talk to various people about this, one of the basic kind of questions to ask is, what does drive corporations or CEOs in the name of their corporate, their corporations to do this? And there's multiple inputs. I think the thing that, that a lot of people think about and that certainly a lot of the opposition is focused on are, consumers and the threat of consumer boycotts. So, one of the things that, a lot of the Republican pushback has been saying is that, these corporations that, have long been our friends should not be blackmailed or coerced or bullied into making statements or engaging in political activity by, consumer boycotts on the left or leftist bullies. But if they do,
boycotts might be okay.
So, consumer, there is there's a sense in which consumers are a piece of this. I think a little less, something that, it's all kind of be more reviewed now. I think in the early phases, what was a little less apparent was the degree to which, management and corporate leadership get pressure from employees and think about potential employees and, particularly in a tight, competitive hiring market,
right.
Particularly if you're a firm that has to hire specialized labor. It's competitive out there, and these kinds of things, whether it's your corporate profile or where you are based and where you are trying to attract employees to come and live or go and live in terms of these big corporations and in multiple places, that's a factor. And then there's also been a rise in recent years in shareholder pressure and what people talk about as shareholder political activism. And so all of these converge, and they converge in a kind of brand pressure to some degree.
Yeah. I think, I think the thing that you gotta kind of take away from this is that, for any given company, none of, getting engaged in these topics is never a slam dunk. This is not something that I think business leaders want to be doing or dealing with. But I think the point you make is key here, which is, there's this idea about boycotts and counter boycotts and whatever. But ultimately, I think, most companies know enough about their consumer market to know, to at least weigh the costs and benefits in a broad sense and something like that. But the other stuff I think is interesting even more so, to the extent that, we have this service economy. And really what we're talking about in a lot of cases is, some higher end employers concerned about their competitiveness at hiring. But then the shareholder thing is also interesting to me, which is, there's been an ongoing discussion over the last few years about whether basically maximizing shareholder value is the be all and end all of corporate activity. And, I would say if you were to ask that question 5 years ago, it would be yes. 10 years ago, definitely yes. And right now, this is, I think, go search this and you'll find a bunch of op-eds about this, written in the last 6 months. This is really an open question for people. And it is kind of, I think, following in some ways, public perceptions about what they're expecting corporations to do.
Right. And again, I think it's easy to get out, over the edge of your skis on this, as you were saying yesterday. I'm struck by, how some media outlets I read or some writers that you read, really make a lot about this as an institutional factor. I mean, Axios comes to mind, and a lot of people love to hate Axios. The smart brevity thing rubs a lot of people the wrong way. I can do smart brevity and long reads. I think we should all just.
I'm impressed by smart brevity because I can't do it.
Be a little cool. Right, there you go. That's fun. This idea that that corporations and corporate leaders are feeling the will to act because other institutions are failing. And do some people feel that way? Some individuals, almost certainly. Is that, and I'm kind of, hitting on what you were saying, baked onto what the real incentives are at the broadest level. And at the end of the day, what a corporation does, how integrated is this in the fundamental reason for being of a corporation, which is to, be a market actor that is profitable? I think obviously, to get, and we're going to go, I want to go there because, if you think about why corporations get involved in legislative politics, it's part, it's closely related to the bottom line. I mean, people are not, corporations are not getting involved, don't hire huge lobby teams to go out and talk about philosophical issues. They hire huge lobby teams to go out and make sure that, the laws that are passed, the regulations that are implemented, are in their interests and don't hurt their interests and contribute to their bottom line. And these things can coexist, but I think unpacking all that is pretty important, and not losing sight of that, I think, is pretty important.
Well, and the other thing that I think is sort of kind of key here to understand too is the fact that, I think there's a little bit of a lag in our understanding to all this. So if we look, sort of at this, we're talking about a sort of an uptick in corporate activism, if you want to call it that. And I'm not even sure if I would want to call it that, but, sort of corporate statements on social issues and movements,
right,
that has really picked up dramatically, I would say, in the last 4 years. I was just going back to see when did Colin Kaepernick kneel during the national anthem. It's kind of a starting point that happened in the last 4 years. You think about the Me Too movement. And even then, corporations weren't necessarily out front sort of standing with women, but they were certainly saying, hey, we're making sure that our policies are up to date and that we're acting appropriately in this space. Right. And again, in a much more sort of comfortable space for them in terms of, HR policies, hiring practices, mea culpas if necessary. And then you fast forward to last summer during the protests over George Floyd's death. And, you saw a lot of companies coming out and, standing with the protesters, but I think they were also being very careful not to be against police officers.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. So it's hard not to, again, not to be overly cynical, but, they're standing with their consumers.
Well, right.
And they're standing with their employees, and they're, the kind of corporate activism thing, and I don't want to get too far ahead. I don't know this history as well as one could, certainly as well as I should even be talking about it too much further. But, it does seem like there is something, a bit more philosophical in the nature of these interventions that is a little different than, much earlier instances of corporate activism or corporate, politics that we saw corporations get involved in, that were a little more narrowly, tailored to their behavior and things like this.
Yeah, well, and I say that's an even earlier instance, but I think the point here is, in the summer of 2020, standing up for unarmed people not getting shot by the police is not a hard stand to make. In the face of, the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, I think, sort of a similar thing here, which is that, it wasn't even similar, it was a little bit different, I would say, which is it was, clearly a political moment that they had to decide whether to act on or not. But you could see in the polling about whether people wanted corporate action, then it was much higher. And part of it is, I think that's where the void argument comes in, is that, watching our institutions fall apart, in terms of the peaceful transfer of power, there was, I think there was more acceptance of more, other types of institutional actors to come out and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not what this is supposed to look like. But you're in for a penny, in for a pound, and you kind of go ahead to where we are now. Right. And I think the question being asked of corporations by a lot of, activists on the ground is, well, you were standing with us, during George Floyd. Why aren't you standing with us when people are trying to take away our right to vote? And a lot of corporations are saying, well, I guess you're right.
Right. Or, their marketing firms and their consultants are telling them, look, the people who are in charge of strategy are figuring out I think maybe figuring out they have to have an answer to that. But I think that, the flip side of that is kind of, is how does this articulate within politics as we know it now in 2021? And, was already, and look, we saw this, if you think back, it was just occurring to me, we polled on NFL favorability, in the wake of Colin Kaepernick and some of the activism and Trump talking about it. And, the NFL took a hit along partisan lines on that. And so, I think that, thinking about how, it may well be that polarization is kind of a factor here, right? In terms of, this may be even harder, they may find, I think the question is, do corporations do this and then find out, wow, that pushback was harder than we thought it was going to be from a broader base of the public because it, drops into a kind of partisan polarized vortex and all this.
Well, yeah, there's like two reactions I have to that. And, one of them involves Taylor Swift, and then one of them is a little bit more thoughtful. The Taylor Swift one was, in the Taylor Swift movie, at some point, she's having a conversation with her manager and her father about whether she should get involved in the election, whether she should make her views known. And basically her business associates are all saying, no, you definitely should not do that. Do you really want to basically drive away half of your audience is the argument. Now, the thing is, for Taylor Swift, that's probably true. It's probably at least half of her audience. And it probably is the case that, I don't, at least before this, I'm not sure that Taylor Swift had a partisan tilt in her, in her audience here. But most businesses don't. If you really think about, the nature of a lot of the business we're talking about, some, are big and they, they serve everybody, whatever. But, there's a lot more businesses, I think, that are just in existence now that serve far narrower slices of the population in a way that, these are not necessarily as risky moves for them as it is for some of these big institutional players. The problem for the big institutional players, the Dells, the American Airlines, whatever you want to say, that do have big, consumer bases is, well, once all these smaller companies are going out and saying, hey, we're standing with African Americans who want to vote, or we're standing with women, it's kind of hard for you to say, yeah, we're not into that. We don't do that. That's not our thing. And especially in a broader context, there's some interesting polling from Morning Consult that was sort of asking people about, what do companies have a responsibility to do? And the thing is, the vast majority of people think that, companies have a responsibility to take care of their employees and treat them well, set an example for their industry, become sustainable, set an example through their supply chains, taking care of the communities they operate in, on and on and on. Down the list, you get to 50% say fight and address racism and social or economic discrimination, which is pretty much about as close as we could get to kind of a partisan split point in the electorate. And I'm sure if we looked at the results of this poll by partisanship, you'd see most Democrats saying they should be doing this, a lot of Republicans saying they shouldn't. But this is the thing that's sort of interesting about this is it's probably the thing they least want to be dealing with in terms of the sort of corporate, responsibility matrix of things they could be dealing with in society. This is probably the least popular.
Right. And then, the other data from that same poll, I think, show that there's also a generational thing, all things being equal. Younger people are a bit more, or, tend to, the younger you are, all things being equal, you're probably more interested in seeing this and a little more politicized on this front. So let's talk a little bit then. Let's say, narrow back down to Texas and think about, so, at a basic level, this is going to make a difference. What's the impact? What's the state of play on this? Now, this is not, as we started, you and I have been talking about this, and I've talked to a few people about it in the last few days and been thinking about this. Even in recent times, we've seen instances where, large businesses, and particularly during a legislative session, have, engaged in a kind of strategy that involves poking their head out, up over the hedge on issues. But it's, there's not enough instances of this for it to make for us to really see any big patterns. But it's still, I think, interesting to look at some of the major instances. So if you go back to 2011 for, those old enough, HEB and very surprisingly at the time, one of the biggest housing construction firms in the state, Bob Perry Homes, pushed back on legislative efforts the first round, and of course they eventually passed it, which is also interesting, to pass anti-sanctuary city legislation. This was, 2011, session, height of the Tea Party. Republican Party enjoyed a huge majorities in both houses. It was kind of the after the Obama midterm election. And there was a lot of pressure from the Tea Party and from the far right to pass anti-sanctuary city legislation. And in fact, Rick Perry had, in campaigning in 2010 and many other Republicans had sort of made this thing out of sanctuary cities as a way of, sort of sheltering immigrants. Now, when Perry and HEB wound up standing up against this, they were relatively successful in the sense that now there was a lot of context there, but this was a part of a broader conversation in which, the Speaker of the House at the time, Joe Strauss, was urging the business community to get involved and to weigh in as a counterweight. And then we saw this again, I think, in 2017 with the bathroom bill. The bathroom bill comes up, doesn't make it in the regular session, gets put on the call for the special session, and that, I think, and this is an interesting tactical point, that's when we saw a much broader sort of pushback on anti-LGBTQ legislation from some of the major corporate actors that are active in the legislature. But it's telling
much broader than during the regular session.
Well, I'll say it's telling to me that they waited until their business was done in the regular session before they really spoke out, quite vocally. And that's been a conversation going on right now, right? Which is that, we've got these three corporations that have made statements. Nobody's really started withholding campaign funds. We're in the realm of the statements, but there are a lot of the major corporations at the legislature right now. There's a lot of significant legislation. You look at the broadband bill, you look at all of the response, that's being processed to the blackout that involves, major energy and utility companies.
Liability protection for COVID.
The liability protection for COVID. There's a lot of things that are very important to business right now. And so I'm wondering if anybody is considering the strategy of, can we hold this off in the regular session? Everybody knows there's going to be a special session this time. Mm-hmm. And so, anything that doesn't, anything that's not the budget that doesn't get through the regular session is going to be fair game for the governor for political reasons or substantive reasons to put on the inevitable special session that's coming for redistricting at least.
Right.
So, these election bills are moving pretty quickly, but it's also, they're not through. Nothing's gone to the governor's desk. And I think, obviously, particularly in the House, the Democrats are laying in wait. If Representative Martinez Fisher is not already compiling points of order and tactical plays, on this, if he doesn't have binders full already, I'm a monkey's uncle.
Yeah. But I mean, but the point you're making here is, I think, sort of, an important one that I think people sort of fail to consider, which is, number one, all of these businesses, all of these industries have legislation often pending before the legislature that is far more directly tied to their business functioning than any of the stuff that we're talking about publicly. It's the sort of stuff that we never talk about publicly because it only matters to people in the industries usually. Right. And so, on the one hand, this idea of, well, what are corporations going to do? It's like, well, they're going to say some stuff, they might withhold some campaign funds, but probably not, And really, if you think about the two sides of this conversation so far, right? The first is there's all these diffuse, societal things going on, and this idea of like talent acquisition and shareholder expectation and brand identity and all this kind of stuff. And like, how does that fit? And then there's like, hey, the legislature is about to reclassify how, someone in your industry, can or can't work. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, if you're AT&T or Google, are you going to sacrifice your stake in the broadband bill to go to the mat during the regular session to oppose the voting legislation? Well, I would say so far, evidently not.
Well, but, I would actually ask another question on the other side of that, which is, how far are Republican elected officials in the state willing to go to punish, let me just put it this way, corporations who are individuals too, from expressing their political views on certain topics? I mean, I think, again, I'm just shooting from the hip. I mean, there's sort of like a kind of a more obvious like status quo where, maybe these corporations continue to, speak out on certain stuff, but they're still going to give donations and they're still going to work behind the scenes to advance their interest on most of the stuff that they really care about. But, the question to my mind is that good enough for Republicans? I mean, I think the interesting thing in some of this is the fact that, Dan Patrick's response to this was so vitriolic, was kind of, I mean, it's not surprising for Dan Patrick per se, but it's a surprising tack, I think, if that's the tack that Republicans as a whole end up taking towards these businesses, because ultimately, it doesn't really serve them any good to be enemies.
Well, and I think what this does is it does bring us then to, in some ways, the political brass tacks of this, which is the coalitional politics underlying, like within the Republican Party, because look, all things being equal, Republicans don't want these corporations publicly telling them what to do per se, even though, in other ways, they privately tell them what to do all the time without being overly blunt about it or get their way all the time.
Not publicly.
But that's right. But the issue here is that there's a big public commitment here. Mm-hmm. And not just a big public commitment that Republican leaders have made in 2021 to this voting legislation, but the way that they have been talking about the underlying priorities of this voting legislation and investing it, not with, their partisan goals, which we know are there, but with this all this philosophical talk about, protecting democracy by shrinking the electorate.
Right.
Or that's not their phrase, that's mine. But, and so the trade-off here is a little, there's a public facing piece of this that really brings out the fact that, the corporations, the corporate actors here with the interest that we're talking about, which is particularly, with somebody like Dell, their interest in employee recruitment, shareholders, and then you've got the other faction of the Republican Party to whom this voting legislation has been marketed as important to is, one, the political class for their political goals, but what we're now calling, for lack of a better word, the populist grassroots of the Republican Party, who have now been told for, pick your number of years, depending on, which part they've been told, for, a decade, but certainly in no uncertain terms for the last 5 years, that the election system is broken and that Democrats are cheating and that Republicans are going to fix that so that they're not cheated out of their vote by all of this non-existent, we should say, voting fraud that people are convinced is going on.
Really ineffective voting fraud too, by the way.
Yes, for example. So in terms of, results. So, there's a part of this where, it's, the history that we were, the coalitional history here, this is not the first time we've seen this conflict. Mm-hmm. And this conflict is as old as the Republican rise and Republican hegemony in the state. Mm-hmm. The coalition that Republicans built, going back as far as, the dissolution and the migration out of the Democratic Party of both voters and elite and business interests, that began, you could pick your spot, I would say, in the, in real terms in the, as late as the late 60s, early 70s, certainly the early and mid 70s.
Yeah.
Republican success has always hinged on managing that. Mm-hmm. On managing the conflict that is now very much in the open in this fight over voting rules. And that's why I think the 2011 immigration HEB, Perry Holmes versus the Tea Party is an interesting kind of, to some degree, smaller scale dress rehearsal for this. Mm-hmm. Because if you think about where, these two big, corporate retail, groceries, and home construction, these were pretty directly interested parties.
Yeah.
Right. In the immigration legislation. This is much broader and bigger, and I think a little more explosive in terms of what the terms of the conflict are between the now very, very conservative Republican base for whom this voting issue has become salient, or at least this view of it has become salient, and corporate actors who are, for their own set of reasons, feeling like they have to engage this.
Yeah, there's a little bit of I don't know, you're playing a little bit of chicken here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because on
the
one hand, if you're a corporation, the question is, well, how far are you willing to go, in pursuing, this position, right? And the same thing is true of Republican elected officials. I mean, it's funny the way that you kind of constructed that is sort of, this idea of sort of, let's say I don't love the term because it's complicated, but like the populist grassroots on the one hand versus corporate.
That's why I bracketed it when I used it.
Yeah,
but
I'm bracketing it again versus sort of these corporate interests. Yeah, you're right. The Republican Party is traditionally, sort of the Democratic Party should marvel at the extent to which the Republican Party has been able to manage these two coalitions together. What I think
Rick Perry was governor for 14 years because of his ability to do that.
And that was, I gotta say, so
in part.
No, and I remember, I started in Texas in 2009, and I remember, in particular, becoming, more acquainted with Rick Perry's, I'll just say his style in particular, but the extent to which he could shift styles between when he's, the guy who's running the enterprise fund on the one hand, and then the guy talking at CPAC on the other, right? The thing I was also thinking about with this is, it's interesting that this is, in some ways that this is the issue. I mean, I think it maybe, there's sort of an obvious post hoc explanation, right? Which is, well, this is fundamental because it's democracy, But I mean, I also think if you think about the sort of things we're talking about here and in the moment in time we're in, I'm kind of, I'm not going to say why is this and not that, but a little bit like, it's interesting that it's this, but it's not like we talked about this a little bit. But the trigger bill that would ban abortion in the state, if the U.S. Supreme Court kicks abortion legislation basically or rules back to the states, it seems to me that there's a lot of the same things that we'd be talking about here. You're talking about, recruiting talent. You're talking about the rights of people, and I mean, I guess what I wonder is going back to why is that issue not something that necessarily, motivates businesses in the same way is kind of just an interesting question, I think. But the other piece of this is, going back to when does the rubber meet the road here is, are any of these businesses going to leave Texas? Because, that's the fundamental issue in terms of managing this is that Republicans have long been able to say, hey, look, our model works. We're one of the best places to do business. We're growing constantly in terms of people, in terms of businesses. Our economy is getting bigger. In multiple points throughout this last 10-year period, they've pointed to Texas's strength relative to the rest of the country, especially economically. Before this dust up, I think most of the news about business in Texas was about businesses moving their headquarters to Texas. And so, to my mind, these corporations can kind of say all this stuff, but if they're not going to leave the state, I'm not sure it really matters if you're a Republican. I don't know.
Yeah, you're gonna have to have more skin in the game. It's gonna have to be more aggressive. The question is, can their opposition have an impact on, the broader unfolding of this? We were talking about the Democrats earlier. The Democrats don't have a lot of cards to play, and this is at least, moderately helpful to them, in the sense that at least it gives them something else to draw attention to this, to try to, affect the discourse. But it also, gives them, it gives them possibly a path if they can stop it during the regular session. I think the speculation inside the building right now, is that this falls into sort of everything else right now, which is what's going on in the House. Right. We know what the Senate's going to do because, there is a general and an army for the most part, and the army is marching where the general tells them to go. Yeah,
they can even go. They can even march back in time.
Right, for example. And the question is through either, unknown, different sets of preferences or a lack of consolidation of leadership or effective opposition or some combination of those things. What are the chances that we see the House, become a very contentious, somebody recently with me, used the term that works in the chamber, use the term meltdown. Now, this was an interested party, and I don't know that meltdown is quite what I would predict. But I think, there's still some, there's some instability and some disruption out there in the House, and that is going to play into this. And so does this corporate fight, and does, the corporations injecting themselves to some degree in this, add to that in some way that is certainly less than, the corporation, the corporate actors going full bore into this. But is more than your actual, writing a letter and then kind of shrinking into the background. And I don't know that we know where that's going to be, where that's going to go. But, we might even know more about this by next week. So I'm going to call it. We're, at about a half hour. I think we're going to talk about this again. The one prediction I will absolutely make is that this is, I think you mentioning the trigger bill and some of the other things floating around out there. I don't think we're done talking about this.
Can I make one more observation before we end about this? Please. I can't. Brevity is not my strong suit. But, listening to, you talk about this and thinking about this more and more, it's funny because I think most of the framing on this right now is really focused on the effect this is going to have on elected officials, or the extent of it, or if it's going to have an effect. But mostly, the idea that this is somehow kind of a seismic thing. And on the one hand, I would say I don't really think that's the case, because it's not as though these corporations are saying, well, we're going to stop donating to Republicans. We're going to start donating to Democrats. They're just saying we're going to stop donating. We're not going to put our hands on this. It's not like they're saying we're going to start funding a bunch of people who are pushing for progressive or social reforms. And so in and of itself, it's not like we're talking about some huge shift in resources, right? It might be a change. But the other thing I was thinking about this is, when I look at the two sets of actors here, the politicians who are pushing these bills on the one hand, and then the pressure they're facing from the corporations, I can't help but feel like, we didn't really get to the polling day that much, but the corporations are in a much tougher spot. I mean, if I'm a Republican political actor here, I know what my voters think about voting. I know what they think about the system. I know what they think about voter fraud and all these things. And I have very clear marching orders. The thing that strikes me, and I was kind of starting this at the beginning about the arc of all this, is that, when corporations got more involved after the death of George Floyd, I think the thing that kind of comes out of that in some way is, well, we started a discussion then about systemic racism. Not that the discussion hadn't already been ongoing. But then the question becomes, if you're standing with, African Americans because they're getting shot by police officers, then the question becomes, well, do you think that those are isolated incidents, or do you think that's part of, broader systemic problems? A question we've talked about in our polling a lot. And, especially for progressive boards, progressive shareholders, really even, sort of socially conscious consumers and otherwise, there's a lot of places to see racism in American society. And for corporations, the question becomes, well, are you going to speak out everywhere you see it, or in some places? And I think, again, there's this idea, I would say, there's definitely a fair thing to be said that democracy itself, the functioning of the whole thing, the whole government system is maybe somehow elevated relative to other considerations, but there's tons of racism in education and policing and housing and all these other areas. And corporations are moving in those spaces too. But once it intersects with politics, I don't know what their end game is. Whereas I do know what the end game is for Republicans. And I think they do too. And it's not a conflict for them, minus the fact, unless they really are concerned about these businesses, which.
Well, I mean, I think that's, it's particularly problematic. I mean, they're at it's almost as if the corporate actors getting involved at this stage of the game, in the legislative process, you don't say this that much about corporations, but they're at something of a disadvantage because of all the factors we were talking about earlier. And maybe that this is not the best arena, that the timing is not optimal on this, but it also then plays in the longer run. I mean, it does go back to the coalition politics where, if you're a state legislator, in a highly gerrymandered state, in a polarized political system, your voters are a pretty powerful counterweight to what the corporations are saying. And so, that does sort of come back to the balance of power in these coalitions, but whether, in the longer run, does this presage movement or not? And I don't, I kind of suspect not in the long run, but I still am, I still wonder if it's going, we have seen it move things. I mean, if we go back to our initial example of, sanctuary city bills, the sanctuary city bills, passed 5 years later. 6 years later. And, there wasn't much pushback at that time for, various kinds of reasons. So, all right, with that, we will get back to more on this in the near future. Thanks to Josh. Thank you to our staff in the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm Jim Henson. We'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.